Hey, it's Stuart Klein here. This is assignment number 4 for me in PIDP 3240, and I'd like to welcome you today to my instructional video on how to solder a copper plumbing joint. All right, so before we get started, what we want to make sure is we have all our materials ready and on hand before we're going to go ahead and solder our joint. First thing we're going to need is either a piece of copper and a fitting, whatever type of fitting we need to make. If we need to make a 90-degree connection, we can use an elbow. They also have straight fittings, 45s, there's a whole multitude. We want to make sure we have some good copper and a good fitting in place on hand. Now, if we need to cut the copper, we're going to want a tubing cutter. These can come in various sizes, one for a restricted area if you're working in tight quarters. You can also have another one that's a little bit bigger. They're adjustable so they can fit different sizes of pipe. We have a cutting wheel on here. And then we also have a tool to de-ream out the end. And we'll get through that once we get into the process. From there, once we have our copper cut, we're going to need a way to clean it and get it prepped for soldering. Here we have a regular piece of sandpaper. That's an option to help deburr and clean up the ends. We have some steel wool to help brighten it up. And they also make these handy tools. It's a wire brush on the ends and a wire brush internally to help clean it and polish it, and you can get it for 1/2 inch or 3/4. Once we've had our material cut, prepped, and ready to go, now it's time to solder it, and we're going to go ahead and need some solder. Okay, you usually come in a roll, and you can get lead free, or you can get some solder with small amounts of lead in it. And we'll need some soldering paste. One more component we're going to need some type of torch to apply heat, and we can either use propane or this is called MAP gas. It burns a little bit hotter, does a really nice job for soldering. So let's get started. We're going to take this piece of copper and we need to cut it in half so we can solder a new joint. Stick it inside the tool. There's rollers on one half and a cutting wheel. We're going to go ahead and snug it up until it's in between the rollers and aligned with the cutting wheel. We're just going to snug it. So turn the knob on the end and just snug it up a little bit. Once we get a little bit of pressure, we're going to go ahead and take this tool and wrap it around a couple times. Okay, and it should get easier. There should be less resistance as we go ahead. We're going to give it just a little bit more of a turn and snug it up again. And we're again going to wrap it around a couple times. And what we're doing is the wheel is actually cutting into the copper. Each time we turn it and twist, it's just slightly slicing into the copper. So twist it around a couple times, again a little tighter on the knob. And soon enough, that cutting wheel will go right through the copper. We now have 2 pieces of copper that we can go ahead and solder together. So when we cut it, we have little burrs on the end, and it won't fit very nicely into our fitting. So what we'll want to do is just take a piece of sandpaper and just rub it through just to kind of knock the burrs off the end. And we'll do that for both pieces that we're going to solder together. Okay, so let's make sure it fits in. Yeah. Okay, good. So now that they fit in, one of the key components to soldering is making sure that our copper material is extremely clean. That's where we can use this brush. We'll go ahead and we'll insert the copper into the end, and we twist this brush around. And what we're doing is we're just trying to get the copper nice and clean and polished up. And as you can see, the end that we twisted and polished with the brush is much cleaner. Great. We'll do the other one, and alternatively to using a brush, we can just use a piece of steel wool as well. So we can grab the steel wool, pinch firmly on it, wrap it around. And we brighten up that piece of copper quite nicely. So again, 2 alternatives for achieving the same goal.
And we'll make sure that end slips in nice. So our 2 copper pieces, they're ready to go. On the other end of this convenient tool, we have a wire brush that we can stick in the end, polish the internal part of the copper. Nice and clean inside. And we'll do the same part here. So prep work is super important. It's going to give us a nice quality soldered joint once we're finished. Okay, so we've got our components nice and clean. They slip together nicely. And they fit really good. So our next step, the theory of solder, is we're going to heat the joint, and that heat is going to melt our solder into place. But we need something to help move it around. We need something to help move that solder into the entire joint. So what we install is we install some soldering paste. We're going to go ahead in here, just grab a little bit out on your finger. We're going to wrap the amount of the pipe. We're going to put a little thin film of soldering paste where it's going to slip into the fitting. We'll do that on both. And we can also put just a little bit inside the joint where it's going to be soldered together. And what that does is this soldering paste heats up and it kind of creates a fluid-like substance. Then when our solder melts into our joint, it flows around with that fluid substance. And it makes sure that you have a complete solder seal on there. All right, so now we're going to test fit them together. It should slide together just a little bit easier now with the soldering paste on there. And from here we're going to move to the vise to show you how we actually solder the joint. Okay, so here we are set up at our vise now, and just so I don't burn myself, I'm going to go ahead and fix the one end into the vise. We're going to put that in there and just snug it up. All right, so we've got our propane torch. In this case, it's our MAP gas torch. And the theory of what we want to do here is we want to get the flame going. And we can do that by pulling the trigger in the unlock position. And it gets our torch going. And what we want to do is we want to heat up right on this area of the fitting. Right where the pipe goes in and the thickness of where it would be that they're touching. Now when we want to warm it up, we'll see that the soldering paste will go liquid. And from there we're going to go ahead and take our roll of solder. We're going to feed it into this joint. Now, we want to know how much solder should we be putting in there, and how do we actually heat it up. Copper's so conductive, we can just take the heat and focus it in one location, and the heat will quickly dissipate around the whole fitting. So we can just hold it in the one spot. And the trick I was shown, this is called 1/2 inch copper pipe. It's the measure of the diameter of it. So if you take about 1/2 inch of the material and just bend it over, you're roughly going to put in 1/2 inch of solder into a 1/2 inch joint. So we know that when that's gone, we've got the right amount of solder in place. So let's try it out and let's see how it goes. So we're going to get our torch. Again, we're going to make sure it's in the unlock position. We're going to open our valve. And we have our torch flame going. We're going to heat into one location. And we'll see that our solder starts to go liquid, our soldering paste. We're going to get it nice and warm. And we can pull it away and we'll melt our solder in when it's warm enough. And you'll see how it just melts in. Rub it around the entire joint. We'll notice that 1/2 inch of solder is gone. And if we look in at that solder joint, it's nice and sealed. So we'll let that cool down. Now, if you're working in a location where you need to continue working, you can have a damp rag and wipe that off. Now, we do have one more solder joint here. So that was in a vertical plane. Now you ask, can we do it in a horizontal plane as well? And let's watch and see what happens. Remember, the soldering paste heats up and allows this material to go in and melt with it and travel around the joint. We're going to warm it up. Take our solder down and around. And we can melt on both the planes. So just to recap, today we looked at exploring how to properly solder a copper joint. And we're going to run through, just do a quick review here. We remembered that we need some copper, some pieces that we're going to solder together or repair, and we can have the pipe as well as some miscellaneous fittings to repair the joint. From there, prior to doing the soldering function, we need to make sure that we clean the end of the copper, and we can achieve that using a proper plumbing tool with wire brushes inside and outside. The inside goes on the tube, outside goes in the fitting. Alternatively, if we don't have that, we can just use regular steel wool to help brighten it up. After we do a cut, if we need to cut a length of copper tubing, we can do that with tubing cutters, and they can come in a regular size or a small size. Small is for tight areas, large one just for regular, more power. If we were doing a cut and we had a burr on the inside, we can take the deburring tool and we can go ahead and just clean out the burrs from the inside. We have our materials. We've cleaned them up with our couple of different options. We can even round off the outside edge of our pipe with some sandpaper to take away the burrs and make sure that they fit in the fittings nicely. Great. So now that we've got it cut, we've chosen our fittings and we've cleaned up the ends, we're going to put it together. But before putting the pieces together on the ends, we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply some soldering paste. And that soldering paste is going to go around the outside of the tube and the inside of the fitting, and it's going to allow us, once it heats up and liquefies, it's going to allow the solder that we put in to the heated up joint that we can do with a torch to smoothly flow around the entire joint. And we'll remember too that a good trick here, how much solder we put into that joint. This is 1/2 inch copper tubing. We're going to take 1/2 inch of the solder, we'll bend it over, and we know now that's how much we need to put in the joint. From there, we remember that we go ahead and we warm up the fitting in one central location. We allow it to warm, we let the rosin get smooth and liquefied, and we then apply our solder into the joint. From there, we end up with a finished product that looks something like this. A nice smooth wrap of solder all around. And this here will take care of repairs around your home, maybe even make some cool accessories. I want to thank you very much for tuning in to my instructional video here today. There is a disclaimer that I'm not a professional plumber, just a homeowner who wants to share the experience with you and hopefully teach you how to do something today. Thanks again. It's Stuart Klein here with How to Solder a Copper Joint.